Welcome to a special webinar series being brought to you by OilNOW TV on the proposed gas to shore project that is happening in Guyana. The government is forging ahead with its plan to land the gas pipeline on shore to produce cheaper, cleaner energy, and this is expected to create new economic opportunities for the country. Notwithstanding the immense potential benefits that this would have, there are challenges and key questions that will have to be addressed. Chief among these are the environmental impact, the cost of the project, and of course, most importantly, how exactly is this potentially going to benefit Guyana and everyone in these 83,000 square miles. I'm Chris Chapwanya, and joining us today to discuss some of these key points are Joel Bagwandin. Joel is a financial analyst at JB Consultancy and Associates. Roger Cranenberg, he's the Vice President of Energy Strategy and Policy at Eversource Energy. And Arthur Deaking. Arthur is the Co-Director of Energy at America's Market Intelligence. Gentlemen, good day to you and welcome to the program.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for having us.
Thank you very much, Chris.
Good to have you all here. Let me just start off by having you each introduce yourself. And, for the viewers out there, tell them a bit about you, who you are, where you're from, what you represent, and then we could get right into it. So, Joel, how about if I start with you?
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Chris. First of all, thank you for having me here, sharing this panel with these distinguished gentlemen, including yourself, Chris. My name is Joel Bagwandin. I think your introduction of me is pretty much suffice. But as you insist, a little bit more about myself. My background is in banking. I spent over a decade in banking. I'm now involved with the private sector. I do consultancies for the private sector as well as some government consultancies. I also lecture part-time. I teach financial management and business subjects at the MBA level and undergrad level. And in terms of, I am Guyanese. I live in Guyana, and I'm very passionate about advancing and contributing towards our national development. Thank you, Chris.
Great, thanks for that, Joel. Roger, tell us a bit about you.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. And I really appreciate you inviting me to this. So first and foremost, I just wanted to sort of comment that I'm doing this as a private citizen out of passion. So a little bit of background on me, it'd probably be a little bit longer than Joel or Arthur. So I was born in Georgetown. I was a student at Queens College, which I learned after the fact what an amazing institution that is. But more specific to this conversation, I have a long career, mainly in the US and internationally in the power sector, the energy sector. You can pull me up on LinkedIn, consulting, lobbying in Washington, DC. And it's a deep and long career in the energy and power sector, advising the top energy companies in the world. Also, I spent a stint in telecom, fixed and wireless telecom. So I'm happy to comment some about that. 20 years in DC. My current role is I lead strategy for Eversource Energy, and most people are probably not familiar what that is, but it's electric, gas, and water utility in New England, which is Connecticut, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire. And we're building offshore wind off of New York. So it's a big company, a lot of operations, about 4 million customers. So I can leverage a lot of sort of the knowledge of such a large organization. And just a matter of interest, our CIO, who I was chatting with yesterday, her dad is Guyanese. So, really, really good group. So I think this is such a super exciting time in Guyana's history and future. And sort of the highest level, I would encourage folks to look at what's the book? It's called The World, a brief introduction by Richard Haas. And specifically, mostly for policymakers, I would highly recommend they read pages 248 and 249. It's almost a prescription for how do you develop a country. And there's some really, really good stuff in there. And we'll probably be digging into some of that. But he mentions things like predictability matters. But yeah, thanks, Chris, for having me.
Thanks again for being here, Roger. Arthur, over to you.
Great. Thank you for organizing this, Chris, and happy to be here with Roger and Joel. So I'm the co-director of energy at AMI, which is America's Market Intelligence. We're based here in Miami, Florida. And essentially what we do is help companies, usually foreign companies, US, European, Canadian, expand into the region. So whether it's in Guyana, whether it's in Brazil, whether it's in Peru, we essentially use our knowledge and on-the-ground sources to help the companies mitigate any risks that they may face and have successful projects in the region.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Arthur, and welcome again to all of you. Let's get right into it. Let's start with some focus on the environmental impact of bringing a gas pipeline to shore. Of course, this is nothing new. It's not a novel concept. It's happening everywhere around the world. But as you well know, there has been heightened environmental consciousness, so to speak, in recent years. And particularly, I would even say that would have gone up a notch following the COVID-19 pandemic and that last 12-month or so period. And with everything that is happening here in Guyana offshore, there is a particular keen focus on the potential impact that these activities could have on the environment. What kind of impact bringing a pipeline to shore is likely to have on the environment, whether it's out there in the Atlantic Ocean or when it lands here and that infrastructure has to be set up? And remember, this is an open discussion, so feel free to crosstalk as you so wish. And I hope that we don't all agree on everything. So let me start with Roger. Roger, what is your take on the potential impact environmentally?
So environmentally, I think it's very important to look at the impact and look at the local impact. And a big part of that is the local sensibilities on that environmental impact. But I will share with you that gas is completely and wholly consistent with sort of an environmentally sensitive future. Sort of a few points I can share with you is if you look at a gas pipeline system in the US, it crisscrosses everything. It's all under the cities. We run a gas distribution company. We buy gas off of a gas transmission company. I was hiking with my kids on a Algonquin pipeline. But the key thing is it has to be done. It has to be done right. And the companies that do it have to be held accountable for not doing it right. And I've read some of the stuff about, solar. Gas is actually very, very complementary of solar. So gas generation systems can ramp up and down very quickly, especially some of the recips that are in Guyana. They're used in heavy wind areas in Texas and Colorado, et cetera, because of their flexibility. And you're starting from oil, so displacing oil with gas, it's a win-win. It also prepares the country for being able to absorb more and more renewables. We see it in New England, you see it in Texas. It's very, very complementary, but it has to be done right, and you have to take into account local sensibilities.
Arthur, you have some speciality in the area of renewables. There are people here who say, that well, gas may be a bit cleaner than heavy oil, which we use now to generate power, but it's not renewable energy. And, we should try to move straight to setting up infrastructure here that is powered by renewables. How do you see this transition moving, Arthur, in a country where the cost of electricity is phenomenal, it's extremely high, that has stymied our growth and development for so long? Now we have access to natural gas. Do we tap into that? Or wait for further down the road when we could set up infrastructure for completely renewable generation of energy?
Yeah, very good points. I think there's a reason why they call gas a transition source of energy, and that's because we can't just simply go from heavy fuel oil straight into renewables. We don't have the technology in terms of batteries. We don't have the infrastructure in Guyana to support that. We don't even have the generation assets in terms of solar and wind ready to deploy enough energy to sustain the grid. So having the gas is essential to have that firm base. And like Roger mentioned, it can be very easily turned on and off depending on how much capacity is needed for the grid. So the fact that there's already these resources available as a byproduct of extracting oil, so these associated natural gas deposits are already available. And instead of flaring them because of excess gas, we put into a pipeline, a 160-kilometer pipeline, and connect it to a gas to shore plant that will, reduce energy costs by perhaps 50% for Guyanese citizens and businesses. So that's going to be huge in terms of increasing the competitiveness of the country compared to other Caribbean nations. And it's also going to create a energy system that's way more reliable and way more firm and secure than the current system that Guyana has. So all in all, it seems like the benefits definitely outweigh any negative effects.
Okay, I'll come back to touch on some of the ways that we can ensure that this is environmentally safe. New regulations may be needed, institutions strengthened or developed. Joel, you have been writing extensively on the cost itself, or the approximate cost of setting up the infrastructure, setting up the plant, whether the pipeline lands at Wales on the west bank of Demerara or elsewhere. Have you been able to attach any kind of a cost to the environmental impact potentially of such a project? I think you're on mute, Joel.
Oh, sorry.
Great, go ahead.
Yes, Chris, thank you. No, unfortunately, no. That is one of the limitation of the paper I wrote, which you're publishing in parts to me. I did not deal with the environmental aspect, but that does not mean it is to be discounted. And that is simply because it was a contextual analysis on the financial and economic benefits, the financial viability and economic benefits of the project. Of course, you need to factor in the environmental impact. And I don't possess that expertise to factor that in, and there is lack of the study to do it. But the government, the official project of itself, the team that was set up to do it, that is part of some of the studies to be done, which will inform the official cost of the project and all the other technical details. Um, so that is important, and maybe the colleagues here, Roger, with their expertise, we might be able to run some numbers to ascertain what the environmental cost might be from these distinguished gentlemen. But from the numbers that I use to do those estimates, subsequently, the vice president would have reported official estimates coming from estimates of the government. He speaks with the government, and those are to the tune of 500 to 800 million US dollars. And that is the cost, that is the estimated cost to the pipe alone, the run the pipe. The onshore infrastructure is probably 2 to 300 million US. So the overall cost, we're looking at about a billion or 1.1 billion US. But importantly, in terms of the financing of it, which is a contentious issue in the minds of a lot of observers and commentators, how will this be financed and what are the financing risks? Now, as far as I know, and when I read the PSA, my understanding is, I may be wrong, Chris, you could correct me, but my understanding is that Exxon will finance the cost to run the pipeline. So if Exxon is financing the cost to run the pipeline, and they're taking responsibility for that, and that is we know that is estimated at 5 to 800 million US. Therefore, the government would only have to find the money to finance the onshore infrastructure, which is 2 or 300 million US. So, or let's even say 500, another 500 million US. So that would have very minimal impact in terms of the national stock of debt, because that is another contention by some observers. It will have a minimal impact on the stock of debt, given where GDP is projected to grow as a result of the oil economy, and then you have the other spin-off effect as well. So our debt, national debt, is at, and based on what I'm seeing and estimates, will remain at sustainable levels, and that is 60% of GDP. All right.
Okay. We're gonna delve much deeper into the financial cost. I'm very happy that you raised what it could potentially cost. And I think when we look at the cost of the project, it's also valuable to look at the cost of not doing the project, and then what that means to the country. Excuse me.
Absolutely.
I would want us to touch on quickly what are some of the key things. This is still on the environmental aspect of it, because I don't think that we should discount concerns as it relates to the environment. And you're all familiar with Guyana and the fact that we still do have very weak institutions here in the country. So I want to touch on quickly what are some of the key things that the country itself would need to set up, whether simultaneously or in advance of that pipeline coming to shore. But just before we get into that, my understanding, Joel, of the production sharing agreement as it is now, is that focuses on oil production specifically. I am not sure if there is an existing framework for the production of gas and commercialization of gas. And I have not seen, at least from my end, a specific cost ratio split
Mm.
between government and Exxon and who would be paying for what.
No, the PSA speaks in limited terms to the natural gas, and what, as I recall, what that single clause says, that depends on negotiations between Exxon and the government, which is
Okay,
ongoing as we speak.
great. So quickly, gentlemen, and this is now open to you all. What if you had to advise the Guyana government on three key things that they should ensure are in place for this project? What would it be?
Maybe I'll jump in and start off, but I wanted to pivot off of something that Arthur said about electricity and the cost. One of the things he said, which I would emphasize heavily, is reliability. So what you'll see is on a first world economy, that reliability is paramount. In New England, we have some of the highest electricity rates in the U.S. But this is some rough numbers from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. For every dollar businesses spend on electricity, they get 100 to 150x economic value out of it. So what that means is reliability is paramount. Some of the things that Joel said, and to your question, I think part of what Guyana should think about is, at this point in their development, external experts are appropriate. If you look at the Middle East wasn't built with completely starting with local expertise. They brought in, there's international experts that can benchmark costs, that can set up structures. There's a lot of lessons from around the world, and how to do this. And going back to Haas's page, those 2 pages, you guys should take a look at it. It's almost 2 pages of a prescription of how to do this right. And then one of the top things he mentions is predictability. You've got to have predictability. And with predictability, you'll get a flood of capital. I mean, Arthur knows this well. There's so much capital out there looking for a home at really low rates. The capital will come if you drive predictability. And part of what you need to drive predictability is, the institutions within the country. The legal system is probably, the absolute beginning. Predictable, fair, again, from an outsider's perspective, a predictable, fair legal system. And then off of that, you build a good financial system. And then off of that, you can, you have, regulatory. And if you look at, the US is not the only model, but you look at sort of the three parts of government. You've got the legislative, which, all the politics happens there day to day. Then you've got the administration, and then you've got the legal court system, and those have to be complementary. And I think some of that is what's necessary. And again, don't try to do this completely on your own to start off with. Bring in some of the outside international experts to help, but put alongside of them local folks that will grow up as the country prospers.
Arda, what would your advice be to the government?
Yeah, I mean, legal is essential. You know, as a foreign investor, you want to know that your contracts are going to be followed through. You want to know if you can have arbitration in international courts. I mean, we all know that Guyana's court system, you know, is based on a British common law, and it works relatively well in terms of respecting contracts, but it's way too slow, way too bureaucratic. And that delays a lot of important decisions. So ensuring that there is some timelines that guarantee cases are resolved by a certain date, I think that's very important when writing your contracts. I think, you know, in terms of the environmental impact, it's essential to have a public consultation with the local communities, not only getting their feedback in terms of how they can participate in the building on the project, but also in terms of ensuring that they get investments and in other areas outside of the project, because we don't want to just focus on developing that project and ignore the rest of the local community. And we've already seen government officials talking about developing a petrochemical sector based on the plant, and also having a liquefied petroleum gas plant. So all of these things are positive, and it's going to lead to a lot of investment and new jobs for a region that's very poor. The Demerara Western region is, of course, a very depressed region in terms of economics. And then just ensuring that the pipeline is constructed with the right, you know, guidelines to prevent any leaks, to prevent any damage to the water, because it's likely going to be underwater. And just ensuring that there's all the right compliances that won't prevent any environmental spill or disaster. You know, all in all, we know that gas plants emit 50 to 60% less carbon dioxide than heavy fuel oil plants or coal, and that's already a huge plus. So just ensuring that all those guidelines are in place, ensuring that you talk to the local community, that will ensure a successful project.
We've seen some persons here say that this project could bankrupt the country. And Joel, you would have responded in some of your columns and so on, specifically as it relates to this. I want to ask you to respond to that, but I also want to ask you that in your calculations, in your analysis of what the cost would entail, bringing this pipeline to shore and setting up that facility, have you also taken into consideration the cost of the overhaul that is necessary of the distribution system here in Guyana? So to be able to generate cheap electricity is one thing, but getting it to people, that's another challenge. And that is a key challenge that we currently face in terms of the distribution system being old, unreliable. And if gas to shore is to be of any benefit, it is obvious that that is going to have to be overhauled.
Chris, you actually took away one of my points on the question you posed. What are the three things? That was one of my answers in terms of institutionally, as you acknowledge, we have weak institutions. The answer, no, I did not factor that cost into the analysis of the gas to shore project, but it is an important cost. It is an important element of this entire framework that has to be addressed. I think the entire GPL needs an overhaul. So that is important, and we need to determine those things. And I agree with Roger that some of these things we need to engage international experts and have local experts work alongside, because we have to get it right this time. We can't afford to address these issues, but they're not fixed. Right? We need to get it right, and so we need all the help. We need all the expertise to help us to fix it, to reap the real benefits of the project. Right? I wanna add as well. I mean, I agree with all the other suggestions by Arthur and Roger on what they would advise the government in terms of what is needed. I want to add to that because of all this, as Arthur alluded, the the spin-off effect, the multiplier effect, what will happen as a result of these projects? These are very positive. We also need as well capital market development. We have a very underdeveloped capital market, one that is dominated by the banking sector. We have a relatively inactive stock market. We need to develop our market. And in so doing, we need to, because of where this thing, all these developments are going to position Guyana, we have to recognize now, and I would like to think or hope that the policy makers in government recognize that we have to look at Guyana's development beyond Guyana. We have to look at Guyana's development as a regional powerhouse, as a regional driving regional developmental agenda. And so when we talk about capital market development, we have to talk about or think of how do we integrate it with regional capital market development. Because for you to develop the capital market apart from the the legislation that you might need, the infrastructure that you might need, and so forth. The other important component that has to also evolve is the behavior of the market. And we have a regional problem in terms of the behavior of our market. And what I mean by this is, for example, we have in the region, this is not only unique to Guyana, but this is the whole Caribbean region. We have a lot of family-owned businesses, right? And because we have a lot of family-owned businesses, these businesses are financed. They finance their investment and their operations from profits reinvested and borrowing from the banking sector. They don't trade on the stock market. We need to come out of that. We need to start building big corporations, big enterprises.
So Joel touched on a couple of areas that I'm very passionate about. So if I sort of step back and look at what's going on, this is a huge opportunity. And to Joel's point, it's a huge regional opportunity. If you look at the cultural heritage of Guyana, and I was born there, I went through QC. There's been a cultural heritage of education is very important. I didn't even realize QC was like the school for the region, for folks that couldn't send their folks to King's College in London. So education is embedded in the culture. It's a sort of the British Anglo sort of structure and culture, and you combine that with the energy gift that Guyana has now, it could become a regional powerhouse. And to some of your questions, Chris, about reliability, et cetera, the engineering geek in me, and I also get to sit in all of our COOs staff meetings that looks at all the nitty gritty of storm response and reliability and squirrels interrupting the system. And this is a 2012 annual report I looked at, and there's industry metrics called SAIDI and SAFE and all of that. But a couple of things that jumped out to me, again, this is a 2012 report, is a big driver of outages is generator trips. So start there. And then in the Demerara part of the country, a big part of it is distribution system. You're not going to, you could, but you're probably not going to fix that all overnight. So you sort of, focus on the critical areas and you build out from there. And you go about this in a very systematic way. And again, if you look at the BEA numbers from the US, the economic benefits you derive is 100 to 150x of what you're spending on electricity. My main message is, accept some inefficiencies and get on with it. There's so much benefit.
Yeah, let's talk a bit about the financial model, and maybe you can provide all of you examples that you may well know of financial models that work for projects like these. Joel alluded to public-private partnerships, going public in some cases with the potential funding. And just before we move into that, Roger, you did mention that you're an old QC boy, and as you well know, I think most of our leaders, presidents, and so on over the last 50 or so years, they came from QC, Queen's College.
I didn't know that.
And so I don't know how you would look at that. Some people say that's a good thing. It's not, depending on where you think the country is.
I think I've done okay.
Yeah, but getting on to the financial model, what models do you think work best, and what a country like Guyana should really be looking to in terms of how is this going to be paid for?
So there are many models that could be explored. One is a project financing model, where you set up a special purpose vehicle, and of course, you need the given given the structure of Exxon and the government, the PSAs between Exxon and the government, you cannot take out the government out of the equation. I say this because there are a lot of persons out there who feel that this thing should be financed completely by the private sector, give the private sector to run with the project. But unfortunately, that can't happen because of the contract agreement that the government has with Exxon. So they have to be at the forefront leading this. The government could hold a 15% or 20% stake, hence that minimizes their exposure in terms of the financing costs. We know that if Exxon is going to finance the pipeline and it's going to cost 5 to 800 million US, and we're saying that this project is a $1 billion project or a $1.1 billion project, then the government has to raise another 300 or 400 million dollars. Now, 20% of that is not a huge risk to the bank of the country, given the benefits that it will bring, right? And you could have a consortium of private investors, and there's a lot of investors looking at Guyana that are excited, that are hyped to come to Guyana invest, including the local investors. So that is one model which I would like to see could be explored. And I will leave the rest for Roger and Arthur to talk about other models.
No, I mean, I think Joel is right on point. And my advice would be, don't shortchange yourself. I see it as less of an issue of it bankrupting the country and more of a risk of underestimating what a gift this is. So my former colleagues at IHS Market, which is a consulting company, when I was there, they just kicked off a body of work that they did for Rwanda. And so I reached back out to my colleagues. And I'm like, I'm talking to my homeland, and can you give me some pointers off of the work you did for Rwanda? And they sent me one part that's public, but it explored a lot of the stuff that we're talking about here, including solar. But to your question on financing and some of the other things that Joel mentioned, it's also mentioned in Haas's book, is don't try to go too fast. Don't try to go from where you are today to a U.S. model or a French model or something. Accept the fact that you're going to transition over time, because going too fast will actually break the system. And that's one of the things that came out in this Rwanda work. But one of the things, very concrete things that it wasn't in the public document that I thought was really interesting. And once I say it, you're going to say, oh, duh, is a financing model that's used for toll roads. So for a toll road, when you first build it, you don't all of a sudden have the road full of cars. Over time, people start using the cars and then it builds up. So the way that's financed is it's back-ended. So instead of sort of amortizing the loan over, starting from day one equally across time, what you do is you do a ramp up. So it recognizes that you're going to have low utilization at the beginning, so your payments are lower, and then it ramps up over time. And in the end, the loan is fully paid for. And the beauty of that model is in a low interest rate environment that we're in, it's perfect. It's a really, really good model because when you're getting all the benefits is when you're making the bigger payments, and then the payments relative to the benefits you're getting are going to be small. So it's an interesting model to look at. It hasn't been used in the power sector to my knowledge, and it's used in toll roads, but it's one of the things that was highlighted in this Rwanda work as a really interesting, innovative financing model.
Yeah, just adding on that, I think that that toll road model is very relevant and interesting, and it's kind of similar to the local content policy that just came out. As the industry ramps up, your share of Guyanese participation increases as well. So it adapts to the current situation of the project in this case. And I think that's the most adequate to sort of reduce the upfront capex that's needed to build this project. But you can also mix it with an SPV, like Joel mentioned, having percentage owned by the government, the other percentage raised through debt and equity instruments through the local or international capital markets. I think that's also a good solution. But all in all, the way they finance it, it's important, but just the feasibility of it, and I know we're going to talk about it later, it makes a lot of sense. Guyana imports $500 million in fuel every year. So building this project, they're already saving $250 million per year. That's the estimate. Say the project costs 1.1 billion. In 5 years, the project already pays for itself. So it's almost a no-brainer in that sense.
And Artem, to your point, it drives, Guyana could be a real, to Joel's point, a real regional powerhouse off of this. I mean, the stuff that you mentioned is concrete benefits that's transparent today, but then the upside of being a regional powerhouse is so huge. So anyway.
Yeah, to add to both points, Roger, I want to add another model that could also be explored. Under the previous government, we signed a line of credit, a 900 million US line of credit with the Islamic Development Bank. We haven't, as far as my recollection goes, we haven't utilized any money from that line of credit as yet. And why I mentioned this, Islamic financing is very different from conventional development financing, right? Islamic financing, how it works, there are different models of Islamic financing, they're leasing and so forth. One is equity. Instead of advancing a loan, they invest in equity in the project. So they take ownership of the project. They share the risk, and in sharing the risk, you share the profit or the premium. So that can also be included in the equation, which essentially would minimize your financing risk. You have a relatively diverse mixture of financing instruments to finance the entire project. And on the regional powerhouse, Roger, when I was doing the paper that I wrote that Chris is publishing to me, there was an IDB study which was done before we discovered the quantum of natural gas that we have. And what the study says is that the region, it lists about 10 countries that their energy sector is driven by fossil fuel. And so the paper talks about the possibility of these regional countries importing natural gas. Now we have 3 natural gas producing countries in the region. We could reverse that with Guyana in the equation. We have Suriname and Trinidad. We could form a mechanism. Those 3 countries could explore forming a mechanism to export natural gas to the region. So instead of importing it from the US, we could reverse that with Guyana equation. So that's how we could transfer this thing or translate Guyana as a regional powerhouse. Not just the domestic demand, but exporting.
Joel, a lot of your comments I agree with, and you're talking sort of focusing on the energy sector, which is the discussion of this talk. But I think even in broader terms, if I could offer some other advice, beyond energy to the government, is focus on leveraging what I would call developing a knowledge-based economy. So focus on things like education, especially women and girls. And Haas brings that out, and he explains why education is important, why specifically education for women and girls are important. Health, safety, security, the infrastructure, the telecom infrastructure. If you look at what's going on, what we're doing now, what's going on in COVID, you do develop a really robust sort of digital infrastructure. The world's knowledge is at your beck and call, and you're starting off of essentially a British culture that's been established. you look at, I worked for a lot of geopolitical types. You look at the layers of advantages that Guyana has with the energy and all of the cultural advantages. It's huge.
Well, I know that you've all touched on this in some aspects over the last few minutes of the discussion, but I want us to get into some more detail now as it relates to the actual benefits of bringing this pipeline to shore. The obvious one would be cheaper electricity. And that is, I think, the primary benefit that most persons are looking forward to. But what are some of the other spin-off benefits from bringing a pipeline to shore and industries that are likely to evolve and pop up?
I'll jump in then, Chris. I mean, electricity, and I would emphasize again, a lot of people, and we see this in our region, focus on cost, but I would say the focus should be on reliability. Take some of those old recips and have a plan to replace them with turbines. You can probably put a lot more power in those stations using turbines, but reliability is paramount. So, and then off of the electric sector, you can fuel data centers, you can fuel a first world telecom system. You can leapfrog countries like the US and Korea and Japan. Go to 5G. You can leverage the battery storage. We're building a battery storage facility that's 38 megawatt hours. It powers the entire town of Provincetown. Just one of the things I learned from our distribution folks is there's this simple device called an interrupter that has a massive benefit to network reliability. They're all things that if you're sort of starting over, so to speak, you can leverage this new technology. And then that could sort of lead you into a lot of what Joel was saying, first world financial system, a first world health research system, a first world IT services. You can look at what happened with Ireland and what they've done. And again, your multipliers are 150 to 150x when you build a knowledge-based economy off of this sort of fairly basic infrastructure of electricity, digital, telecom, etc. And you're starting, compare it to India. India's first language is not English, but look what they've done. Guyana's first language, arguably is English. I'm just joking. It's obviously English for the English culture. Underlying, it's a huge advantage. There's so many industries, but I think you also have to be cognizant of you're starting from where you're starting, and not everyone's going to be an investment banker. You have to provide opportunities for everyone in the economy. I have very fond memories of going to what we call the interior as a kid, and Americans would die for that. I know that some of the Exxon folks go fishing with my cousin for the big freshwater fish. I can't remember, but anyway, the point is you've got to make something for everyone in the economy, and I think one of the areas that everyone can benefit from, maybe not this generation, maybe it's the next, but education.
Yeah, just going off of that, I mean, I think the reduction in electricity costs is an obvious. I think we've seen in Trinidad and Tobago comparable power plants using gas cost around 4 to 5 cents per kilowatt hour, and using diesel in Guyana can cost up to 50 cents per kilowatt hour. So that's a huge decrease in the cost, and that will make the businesses more competitive. Will make exports cheaper. And then from there, Guyana can start serving as a regional export hub, as a regional headquarters for multinational companies. You mentioned the IT, you mentioned telecom. It could be a huge place for insurance as well. A lot of the policies are written in the UK market. The Latin American policies are written in the UK market. So if you have a country like Guyana who can contain some of that capacity in the continent, that's already huge. I know we're speaking, kind of in a grand vision of things, but I think it's important to have those visions to really get, substantial progress in the country. And like you mentioned, Roger, it's also kind of important to have everyone benefit. And in that sense, we kind of have to be realistic about the current situation in Guyana. I think 25% of the labor force is still unemployed. Most of it is unskilled labor. So it's important to really have education and technical training that prepares the Guyanese citizens to provide the services that need to be provided. I think the local content policy, that's the idea behind it. It's from my view, it seems like the thresholds are a little bit high for some of the more technical services. So perhaps starting with a smaller percentage first and then building, which is the goal, but in a more realistic number that can be, satisfied by the Guyanese current situation. I think that's very important as well.
Absolutely. I agree with both Roger and Arthur. Chris, I know you said you hope we don't agree too much with each other, but I guess great minds think alike, Definitely, the benefits of the project is humongous. It means that we could now drive a massive industrialization plan for the country. We can now become more nationally competitive. National competitiveness means farms becoming more competitive, producing at lower costs. Right now, energy accounts for about 40 to 50% of the operating costs of manufacturers. If we could more than halve that cost, imagine what you're doing and what you're going to attract. And especially, Guyana is at a place today the with its with the emerging petroleum sector at a place where it is getting so much of global attention that it has never gotten before. Global attention and global interest. We have never had this level of global interest over the last 15, 20 years. And so we need to exploit that to our advantage, right?
Yeah, and I would add to that, Joel, and this, you'll see many studies on this. Don't stop at oil and gas. Think more than that, because you've got the Dutch disease. You've seen it in certain countries. You stop there, you limit a lot of your potential. There's so much more potential that can be built on top of it. A broader, deeper economy that's more resilient over time. And you can build very high margin economies. Again, knowledge-based economies are very high margin. I live in Boston. You've got institutions like Harvard, MIT, and then with a good digital infrastructure, you've got access to a lot of that. A lot of medical research is done in this area, robotics. Anyway, you get the point.
All right, gentlemen, we are coming up to program time. I think that this was a very spirited discussion. We covered a lot of ground, and there is so much more to still discuss. Arthur began touching there on local content. That's an entire program by itself, or several such programs. So I will be inviting you to join us again at some other point in time where we can look at some of the other possibilities that Guyana now face with the oil and gas industry and the multi-billion barrel resources that are offshore. And the fact too that the country wants to ensure that focus is placed, the government wants to ensure that focus is placed on the other sectors, and that we're not just focusing on oil and gas alone. So concerted efforts are being made in that regard, and it's also important to have those types of discussions so that Guyana does not end up like some of its very closest neighbors in terms of how they would have handled their resources. So on that note, I'd like to thank you all, Roger Cronenberg, Joel Bagwandin, and Arthur Deaking for joining us today. We do look forward to having you on the program again, and you do have a great day.
Thank you, Chris. Have a good day.
Thanks, guys. Joel, Arthur, Chris, it was a pleasure. Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.